Hello, hello, wonderful to have you here. On today's video, what I want to do is to continue our path along the four jhanas. And today we'll reach the culmination of that path in the fourth and final jhana. These are these states of deep meditative absorption that we find in early Buddhism. And what we saw in our last video, just to recollect or recall it, because this is a process and it's good to always keep in mind where we're coming from. In our last video, we saw how in the third jhana, this feeling of rapture, of what's called piti in Pali, this kind of bubbly, pleasant feeling has died away. What we're left with is a very still kind of mental state, a mental state without much activity at all, a simple, open, mindful, equanimous awareness of bliss. In that sense, the third jhanic state is a state of simple bliss, of simple happiness, a simple awareness of happiness. However, if we continue down this path of increasing peace and calm, increasing mental focus and unification of the mind, if we like, we'll find that there is indeed a further step to take. And to get there, what I'll do, as in the prior three, is to look at the definition of the fourth jhana that we find in one early sutta. In here it says, giving up pleasure and pain and ending former happiness and sadness, they enter and remain in the fourth absorption, or fourth jhana, without pleasure or pain, with pure equanimity and mindfulness. So key to this fourth jhana is this element of giving up pleasure and pain, happiness and sadness. Now, it's pretty clear that in the first three jhanas, we've already given up pain and sadness. Those feelings don't exist in the first three jhanas. All that we have is perhaps pleasure and happiness. And indeed, we saw that pleasure and happiness have sort of become more and more refined as we have moved forward into the three jhanas. Now with the fourth jhana, it's moved to a state where happiness and pleasure have completely died away. We're no longer in a state that can be called pleasurable or happy. What we're left with is equanimity. So we might say, well, we might wonder, okay, what's the problem here? What's the problem with happiness? This sukha that we had in the third jhana, this state of bliss, as it's called, or one translation could be bliss, another translation could be happiness. These are the problems we have to deal with when we're translating from a foreign language. But in any event, we might wonder, okay, why do we want to get away from that? Well, the idea here in so much of Buddhism, and indeed in this progression of jhanas, is that if we like, one way to put it would be bliss or happiness is, again, too active a kind of mental state, and that as we're looking towards peace and unification of the mind, even that happiness has to die away in order to gain that true peace. Perhaps we might think of it as the happiness being something that has a subtle kind of egoistic draw to it, a subtle kind of attachment or grasping. As this state is somewhat subtly, very subtly active in the mind, it tends to move the mind in its direction, and as a result is slightly agitating. And so as we work to calm the mind, that state too must cease, or will cease of its own accord as we continue down this road towards peace. And indeed, as we do continue down this road, we find that the pleasure associated with peace is actually a higher pleasure, a greater pleasure, than the pleasure we were having before with our normal happiness or bliss that we had in the third jhana. Now, this is one of these, we might understand it as a kind of a paradox or a complexity of the early Buddhist understanding of our feeling of pleasure. That from a lower stage, what seems pleasure from a higher stage will be understood as actually painful. So, for example, we began with these mental operations, which were part of a pleasurable state. As we got deeper, those mental operations began to be understood as themselves disruptive, or perhaps unpleasurable in a sense, because of their disruptive nature. They died away. The rapture that we saw in the first two jhanas, which was understood as a pleasurable state, it's a state of real pleasure, not happiness, but pleasure. From the perspective of the third jhana, that rapture, that piti that we saw before, was understood in a sense as being painful. It was too disruptive, it was too active, so it died away. Now we're in a stage where even the happiness, the bliss of the third jhana, and indeed of all the first three jhanas, that bliss itself is seen as subtly painful because of its subtly disruptive nature. And so it too dies away, again to be replaced by this feeling of simple mindful equanimity. Once again, there's a simile associated with this fourth jhana. I discussed in the last video, by the way, about how these similes, there's some controversy over whether they're original to the jhanas, whether they may be late additions. There's a whole bunch of back and forth in them. They exist in all traditions, but it's not clear to what extent they are supposed to mirror the jhanas, but we'll just leave those aside for now. I discussed them in the last video, and there's really no way, I think, to completely resolve that issue. So in any event, for the fourth jhana, the simile goes like this. It's like someone sitting wrapped from head to foot with white cloth. There's no part of the body that's not spread over with white cloth. In the same way, they sit spreading their body through with pure, bright mind. There's no part of the body that's not spread with pure, bright mind. Now, once again, as with the last three jhanas, if we take these similes seriously, if we believe that they are indeed original to and discussing the jhanas themselves, then this is once again something felt in the body. It can be understood as a form jhana, where form in this context means bodily form. It's a jhana that references our feelings in our bodies. It's not even the fourth jhana is not something that's simply a mental operation, but it's a bodily felt experience. Again, to repeat myself, this is a controversy. Some people don't believe this. Some people think that in particular, third and fourth jhana, perhaps, maybe all the jhanas are not felt in the body. But you'll have to go to a jhana teacher, and each one will have their own opinion about that. In any event, that's what the simile says. Now, there are a number of things we can say about this simile of being spread over with a white cloth. It may, for example, signify, in a sense, or at least echo the idea of death, being spread over with a shroud of some kind. This is something that I find pretty clear, but it's not been discussed to my knowledge, at least not much. Another aspect of it has to do with the luminosity of the mind, which is sometimes associated with jhanic experience. I did a video a while back on that luminosity of mind, which became very, very important in later Buddhism, and I'll leave a link to that video down below in the notes. In any event, this description that we find in this simile, Bhante Sujato, Bhikkhu Sujato, who did the translation, translates it as pure and bright. That is one way to translate that, but perhaps the more literal translation would be clean and purified. So the notion of brightness, in other words, luminosity, is not really explicitly in this simile. However, I think this idea of light pervading a white cloth or permeating a white cloth at least suggests a kind of a diffuse field of luminosity that might occupy the entire mind. At least that is one potential interpretation we can take out of this simile. Now, the third jhana was already typified by equanimity. However, it was not said to be pure equanimity. And I think this purity has to do with this perhaps subtle grasping associated with pleasure, associated in particular with bliss, with happiness. That once that subtle kind of disturbance of the bliss of the mind disappears, then the equanimity becomes pure. It is pure. It is not the mind is not tilted slightly, very subtly towards the blissful, pleasurable, happy stage, but is simply residing in equanimity, which is a getting away from, again, pleasure and pain or happiness and sadness. So what we're seeing here is a progression to higher and higher forms of pleasure. And these higher forms of pleasure are such that from the lower stages, they don't look like pleasure. From the lower stages, they look simply like equanimity, a stage which is neither pleasurable nor painful, right? Which is not happy nor sad. However, once we enter that stage, then we see it as a higher form of pleasure. This is how the Buddha and his disciples described it. In other words, it is itself a form of pleasure, but it is not called pleasure because from the lower stages it doesn't look like pleasure. We've gotten beyond pleasure in the ordinary sense. We've risen up to a stage of peace, but that peace is itself sort of paradoxically pleasurable, right? In fact, it's deeply pleasurable. It's more deeply pleasurable than what we saw before. This is simply an aspect of the Buddhist understanding of pleasure and of the way that we train our minds to see and understand these higher forms of mind, these higher, more pure forms of mind that are attained in deep states of meditation. Now, as we've seen before with the prior three jhanas, each of these jhanas has a thorn, has something that, if it arises, it does not allow that jhana to manifest. For example, the thorn to the first jhana was sound, so if it's very loud around where you are, you're not going to be able to attain the first jhana. It's said that the thorn to the fourth jhana is breathing. Now, some people take that to mean that breathing must literally cease in the fourth jhana. To my mind, that is physically impossible. That's not an accurate way of understanding things. However, that is a way that some people will discuss. My own feeling is that this must mean something quite different. Probably what it means is more like that the breathing must become so subtle and refined and quiet and perhaps slow that we no longer notice it. Or, alternately, that the mind is in such a deep state of absorption, a deep state of meditation, sort of a deep state of quiet, that we don't notice breathing. This would imply, however, that we did notice breathing in the first three jhanas, and that's questionable. That's one of these kind of controversies. Nearly everything that I've said about jhana in these videos is contested to one degree or another by various scholars or practitioners. It's debated to what extent or whether jhanas are felt in the body or which jhanas might be felt in the body. It's disputed about how deep jhanas have to be, or we might say how deep a meditative state you have to be in before we call it a jhana. Some practitioners believe that jhanas originally were relatively light. Other practitioners believe that jhanas were never relatively light, that they were always very deep states in which we were essentially no longer aware of the world around us, or to a very, very important extent not aware of the world around us, at least in the last three jhanas and perhaps in all four of them. There are any number of controversies here, and indeed there's been quite a large amount of, at times, unseemly kinds of arguments between various, again, scholars and practitioners within Buddhism, of accusing one another of, claiming to be in a jhana they've never actually achieved, or on the other hand, claiming to, achieve jhanas that are not necessary just because they have an egoistic wish to become in deeper states of meditation than other people. Anyway, these arguments I discussed in a prior video, but they don't, again, for the purposes of these videos, we simply have to understand what the general picture is, and then we can go back and try to figure out what we think if we decide to go into the practice. The Buddha himself recommended that monastics not discuss these kinds of jhanic attainments, in particular, I believe, with lay people, for these kinds of reasons, I think, because you get into arguments, you get into discussions, you get into egoism, you get into a conceit of, I've achieved this and you haven't, I've achieved this and this other guy hasn't, and there's no way essentially to prove that to somebody, certainly to somebody who hasn't practiced themselves. So it ends up being kind of meaningless arguments over, conceit. And so that doesn't help things. But in any event, if you want to look at some of this discussions, because they are themselves to an extent important to understand, I have an earlier video about the depth to which jhana is supposed to go. And I'll leave a link to that video up here on the screen if you haven't seen it, or if you want to see it again, if you want to refresh your memory. And if you're getting something out of these videos, take a look over at my Patreon page, which is linked down below, and see if you want to help out and support the channel, as well as getting some nice things in return. Thanks so much for watching. Hope you enjoyed these videos on jhana, and we'll catch you on the next one. And meanwhile, all of you, be well.